Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's Energy Networks Australia webinar to launch the first two in a series of guidelines for the connection of distributed energy resources, with the release today of the guidelines for basic, micro, embedded generation connections and also low voltage embedded generation connections. My name's Stuart Johnston from Energy Networks Australia, and myself and Tim Edwards from Cutler Mertz will be your hosts for today's webinar. In terms of the structure of today's webinar, Tim and I will actually take you through an overview of the intent and development process for the guidelines and the feedback received from stakeholders on the draft, and how our follow-on actions and decisions in resolving those to ready those documents for publication, how we actually made those decisions, and then finally touch on the compliance and our next steps in this program of work. That is actually the work we're going to go on and to do next, which is actually developing the medium voltage and high voltage guidelines for the distribution system. However, before we get going, I think I'd just like to quickly say to people in terms of the housekeeping around the actual webinar. The first of all is please don't put us on hold for your audio, because we've had periods in the time where that's actually impacted the audio for others. And secondly, we're going to actually go through the whole of the presentation ourselves. If you've got questions throughout that process, there's a dialog box off to the side of the screen. Please feel free to actually type any questions you may have into those dialog boxes. And myself and Tim and Sanika will actually then, at the end of our presentation, go back and actually go through those questions and answer them if they haven't been done already through the actual presentation. Also, when you're actually putting those in there, please ensure you put enough detail in those questions just to make sure that it's easy for us to understand. Otherwise, we may go down a different pathway. So, in terms of the actual guidelines themselves, this piece of work started around 2 years ago in terms of the thought process which came out of it, and actually came out of the roadmap from our side of things in terms of it was seen as a key priority for the industry. And what we're trying to achieve with these is actually set up a series of guidelines which set out the structure, the definitions and technical settings that all Australian distribution networks should adopt in the development and application of their own technical requirements for grid connection for distributed energy resources. The guidelines use instructional language directed towards network service providers in developing and applying their technical requirements. Also, please note that these guidelines are intended to address and standardise the current technical requirements for connection. Through the consultation period, some people raised the idea of making them more future-looking. However, these documents have to be in line with the current rules and requirements to connect now. However, to ensure that they can adapt to changing requirements, we've built a review process into the guidelines to allow them to be updated quickly as required going forward. So the whole idea is, as things come forward through, say, programs like another program that Energy Networks Australia is doing through Open Energy Networks, they can actually inform these, or if there's new rule changes that actually come through, we've got a process to actually revise those quite quickly as needs arise. In terms of the current suite of guidelines, this slide actually gives you an overview of what we're planning to do as part of this program of work. We've got a framework and principles guideline, which has actually already been published and was actually published in June in 2018. And the idea of that document was to specify the number, scope and structure of the subsequent guidelines, but also set the framework about how they're actually going to be developed, and also sets the rules around the review process and had a agreed aspect around that. We've then got the basic and LV guidelines, which are being released today. And we're also intending to have another guidelines on medium voltage and high voltage, which we've only just started work on actually putting these together, and they're intended to be released in July 2019. Again, through the stakeholder consultation, stakeholders identified or raised with us the possibility of other guidelines that could go into this suite of guidelines, particularly around either storage, specifically for storage, or for transmission level connections. We haven't made a decision around that yet, but that'll be assessed as this program goes on to see if those requirements or those documents are needed. So, who are these guidelines actually applying to? Well, we actually developed these specifically for the DNSPs, or distribution network service providers, to utilise to directly adopt in the development and application of their technical requirements for grid connection of distributed energy resources. So they'll use these as a template for their own guidelines, which stakeholders will use. Other stakeholder types can actually utilise these documents, but they're not directly for them. The whole idea is they can use them, say, for proponents to actually navigate and understand some of the requirements at the high level and what we've actually tried to do with these, from the AER to assist in determining whether the technical requirements as proposed by the distribution companies in model standing offers are fair and reasonable, and other stakeholders to actually sort of get an understanding of what their their connection requirements are. We've also looked at, in terms of the transmission side, is actually to try and to consider and aligning principles and developing technical requirements for grid connection as well. The reason for this work is evolved from multiple reviews and studies which have been done previously that all identified major concerns with current connection processes across the country, particularly in the areas around lacking of clarity and also consistency between jurisdictions, or even between networks within the same jurisdiction. So the idea of these documents are to actually have a national framework which all of the DNSPs can actually use to increase their consistency in terms of the technical requirements, documentation requirements, structure of the technical requirements, improve the clarity with respect to those technical requirements in terms of what's required, what's needed. Try and actually strike a better balance between the mitigation of network risks and network costs, and the efficiency in the connection process for proponents, to try and make that a lot easier for proponents to do, and a lot more timely in terms of how that's actually going to be taken through. And it'll actually then hopefully remove some of the oneruses of technical requirements that are in the current systems at the moment. And finally, it's to establish a platform for networks to develop common standards and protocols for future management of active distributed energy resources. So the whole idea is that it's how we can actually roll those out and make sure they actually is utilised in terms of the rolling out of those common standards and protocols, particularly for things like communication and data management, etc., etc. Energy Networks Australia will ensure these guidelines remain relevant, particularly given the rate of change that's going on in the industry at the moment, which could have major impacts on both regulatory and technical settings that are actually there at the moment. The guidelines, we've actually built within the system a review process which will actually be done on an annual basis to identify whether there has been technology or regulatory triggers for an update. We're also looking at having independent evaluations will be conducted to determine the level of compliance and whether the desired outcomes have been achieved in both with the networks and proponents' perspective. The guidelines review and implementation evaluations. The first guideline review will actually be done 6 months after publication. Now, this will just be a high-level one, just to look at any teething issues that we've got with the first level of these documents, in terms of there's some other pieces of work that we're actually doing at the moment around Vault VAR, Vault Watch, which hopefully will be actually solved by that feature, so we can actually then quickly update the documents to actually take that into account. The first independent evaluation will occur 1 year after publication, and then we're looking at having independent evaluations will be conducted every 2 years thereafter. So in between, we'll just be doing our own evaluations in terms of a review and update process, and every second year there'll be an independent evaluation. Those evaluations will actually be published on our website. How do we actually develop these documents and the technical settings that sit within them? That was actually done through a lot of engagement across the industry over the last 6 to 12 months to actually do this. So we had direct engagement with primary stakeholders through meetings and workshops, in particular with the networks themselves. So we had individual workshops with every single network. And we also then had follow-up meetings going back and forth over different iterations of drafts with network companies. We also met and have talked it through with members and the Clean Energy Council themselves, Australian Energy Market Operator, and the AEMC. But we also have talked to other key stakeholders across the board as well. So we've also internally, we've done quarterly briefings up to the within Energy Networks Australia to our Asset Management Committee, who are actually the sponsor for this piece of work, to make sure that we were actually keeping to track, we were actually making sure that there were any issues, we could actually take it back through that committee to oversight and actually look at decisions and processes to take it forward. We've also held 2 public webinars since we actually launched this, and also we had a draft revision process via emails, and we received some submissions back on from each of our DNSPs, but also other key stakeholders such as the CEC and the AEC on the actual final draft of this document or these documents. So again, the principles in developing these technical requirements were to deliver consistency, improve clarity and transparency for the connection process, try and actually balance network risk with connection efficiency, and reducing both time and cost impost on, or unnecessary cost impost on the customers. Creation of a process that can quickly respond to changing requirements of the industry. So that review, building that review process has been very, very key for this, and making sure that that's put in place and actually agreed to. And by doing this, actually, that will help hopefully promote innovation going forward in terms of how the system actually evolves and going forward with more and more distributed energy resources being connected to the system going forward. I'm just going to pass over to Tim Edwards now. He's going to actually take you through a bit of an overview on the documents themselves, and then go through some of the key bits of feedback that we got from stakeholders, and then how we've actually addressed some of those within these documents. Thanks. Thanks,
Stuart, and good afternoon or morning, wherever you are in Australia. Pleasure to be here with you. This section over the coming half a dozen or so slides, we'll be working through the contents or the table of contents of the actual guidelines that we're pleased to say have actually gone live today on the ENA website. And after introducing the table of contents, we'll actually be working through the key themes that we've received feedback on between the end of December and February, that we've looked to either incorporate to further improve them or capture as follow-on notes, with those themes being then broken down across the coming slides in terms of what the key issues are within the themes of the feedback and how we've looked to address them within the guidelines or in separate avenues for communication. The summary of the contents, and even though the table of contents is slightly longer than what you see on this page, the main crux of the document, be it LV or basic guidelines, are captured structurally in a similar way and work through a lot of the background that Stuart introduced on this webinar already, and then work towards as that instructional document to DNSPs, where DNSPs then develop their own particular standards for the connection, a sense of the introduction to the technical requirements, the use and the consistency of definitions, abbreviations, terminology, the relevant rules and how they're to be leveraged within the individual DNSP standards as they're developed. The most critical and longest part of each of the LV and basic guidelines is the technical requirements of grid connections, and that's where, based on a framework and principles guideline that was released in June 2018 by the ENA, a set of agreed technical requirements are captured, but then, if you like, specified in a manner to start introducing that consistency across jurisdictions and that clarity amongst the technical requirements. Fees and charges are there mainly so that links can be made and so that the document in and of itself can be comprehensive by pointing to where relevant fees and charges for connections are. And then testing commissioning requirements as well as operation and maintenance look to recapture the technical requirements of grid connections in a manner that's going to be ongoing, tested as well as verified by NSPs to ensure what was installed is captured in a way by the installations proponent and so on that's mutually understood as at the time of installation. The appendices are actually quite significant, and particularly the first one around the deviations with justification. So every standard that gets developed within a DNSP in response to these guidelines is going to have an Appendix A deviations section that actually outlines the extent to which, if there are technical parameters that can't be complied with, why that is the specific case for that jurisdiction, with adequate justification for proponents and customers at large to understand the specific constraint or network security risk or reliability risk that's present as a result of that technical requirement not being met. And so there is a sense of being able to capture the efficiency and the uptake of the being furthered as a purpose through that capture of deviations, as well as through a means of being able to actually work on minimizing those deviations as NSPs start complying with the requirements of the basic and LV connection guideline. It was fantastic between the end of December and February to receive a number of very well-constructed feedback letters to the ENA from stakeholders such as the CEC, Energy Australia and others. And the idea behind those went to the benefit of these guidelines in multiple ways. Firstly, where there were improvements on the specific guidelines, and we've captured them in the follow-on slides. We've looked to capture those improvements between releasing it from a draft to a final set of guidelines. Secondly, there was a good sense of what may still be required as a communications piece. So we've iterated a few times, and Stuart mentioned that even though these are DNSP facing, there is a requirement for alternate avenues for communication so that the system at large is, and proponents and customers are actually across what is the meaning of these guidelines to them, albeit they are DNSP facing. And so the feedback did highlight specific areas that were quite helpful in us being able to plan for next steps around communication so that, albeit a DNSP facing set of guidelines, others are brought along the journey with FAQ style documents and scenario style documents that would support in actually getting the message across and striking the balance between consistency and clarity, but at the same time ensuring that no network risk is increased due to the uptake of distributed energy resources. The next 10 slides or so actually capture the 10 key themes that we've got up on the slide at the moment, and so we'll just proceed to work through them one by one, with the key element within those themes being captured, so we can give you a bit of a background as to what the extent of the feedback was and how we look to respond to that feedback. Objectives, audience, and iterations. As Stuart mentioned, there is a sense of the audience of the guidelines being the DNSPs, and a lot of the discussion that came in the form of feedback was around ensuring that irrespective of the directly applies or the direct audience, there is a sense of what can be done to ensure, as we've got in the third point there is an empowerment to consumers with relevance to access of the information that comes with their investment choices that are directly or indirectly impacted by these guidelines. So just in terms of a slight tangent around that, the ENA has actually prepared in support of controllimis a set of FAQs, and there are direct responses to those individual letters of feedback that have come through. And the idea there is to start working towards, outside of the launch, which is today, a sense of being able to widen the communication piece to all stakeholders, irrespective of the primary goal and focus and audience of these guidelines being DNSP facing guidelines. Just touching very quickly on the last 2 points there, working with a sense of expediency so that we can maximize the question time, but consistency versus specificity was dealt with in the guidelines by ensuring that there was a sense of being flexible in the adoption of technical, a flexibility in the adoption of certain technical parameters so that NSPs can have a broader range to choose technical parameters from, but that was always balanced with the need to converge and create a baseline that was best practice, or that was, from the perspective of the national electricity objectives, a means of being able to maximize the use and the utility of the system for end users. And so there was a lot of challenge and iteration to be worked through in coming up with the technical settings so that we can balance those two elements of specificity versus consistency. The process of evolving the guidelines can't be emphasized enough, with Stuart touching already on as early as 6 months into this process. We'd be looking at actually setting out what the next iteration looks like. And a lot of this comes with a sense of, why are we doing that if we need to change things as soon as 6 months from now? A lot of it has to do with really needing a baseline to start from and to move from very quickly. But in the absence of that baseline, we don't have a starting point. References to Australian international standards. A few comments came through in the feedback around reference to standards and expediting the understanding and the clarity on the basis of being able to link the guidelines to standards that are already established. And you will note, if you've got the chance to work through the guidelines, that they do heavily reference the relevant Australian international standards with additional bespokeness to apply to the outcome of the consultation with DNSPs and other parties to suit the objectives of the guidelines specifically. You'll find that there is a heavy emphasis on solar PV, though we do appreciate that battery and other ESS related technology is going to be prevalent in future years. But a lot of that comes back to, as Stuart says, being able to create a here and now point in time that captures the current issues before we look at progressing them in support of and in collaboration with the open energy networks and other programs so that they can be advanced enough as things evolve on those parallel projects. The guidelines are not an explanatory document, and that comes with this follow-on point around them being DNSP facing only. That really captures the sense that there were quite a few comments around trying to simplify the guidelines further so that they can be consumed by a much broader audience than DNSP. We've heard that, and we've looked to create several other communication pieces that will accompany the guidelines as they're released on the basis that that understanding across the board is increased. Processing and speed of processing was a theme that came through quite strongly, and in linking back to the framework and principles guideline for establishing the follow-on LV, basic and other guidelines, there was an intentional focus of technical content over process, with the idea being that we are looking at ensuring that the processing elements that need to happen within an individual DNSP are sometimes overlapped with, but often divorced from having to work through a set of consistent parameters technically. Notwithstanding that, there was a sense of expediency of processing that was kept in the back of our mind as we were developing the guidelines, and with particular reference to the basic connections guideline, there was quite an emphasis on ensuring that the technical parameters were set at a level to enable the expediency in processing and expediting the connection. As we work through the LV guidelines, and given that the technical parameters start becoming a bit more broad and bespoke, and in some cases there's an individual connection to a customer, if the size of the installation is large enough, more negotiation as well as processing time is expected, and that comes with the increased risk that, for that individual installation is presented to the network that needs to be considered. Voltage response mode, a lot of what was discussed in terms of feedback around voltage response modes was really the coexistence of volt var as well as volt watt response modes. And in a lot of manufacturing scenarios, there's either one or the other that may be available as opposed to both being available and made active. This is something that we've pushed for within the guidelines on the basis that the end user, the proponent, the customer, is likely to benefit more from the ability to be able to get further DERT penetration on the balance of having both volt var as well as volt watt response modes being available and active. That is also being worked through separately in the communication around what that means for our proponents and end users. It is also worthy of note that through discussions with AEMO as well as DNSPs, there is a parallel project that is being worked through that actually looks to provide far more specificity around the volt var and volt watt settings, so that even though they're introduced in the current guidelines, more specifics around what they practically mean for those who are installing the systems is going to be worked through and completed in the immediate short term, and in fact those projects have already kicked off. Lots of comments around ESS, and I touched on this briefly earlier, and the idea is really a sense of making sure that we're capturing the prevalence and the high penetration of solar PV at the moment without discounting ESS, so much so that there is a strong sense within the ENA and amongst stakeholders that after the completion of the MV and HV guidelines, which is due by July 2019, that the next guideline to follow is one that's focused on ESS and how the technical requirements for connection relating to ESS are captured within that guideline. Notwithstanding this, there are several references at the moment within the basic and LD guidelines on ESS, and they're captured in a manner that allows the expandability of ESS and that allows the opportunity for consumers surrounding ESS installations. Generator control was another theme that came through in the feedback. And there's really a sense of looking to balance these and navigate through the different network topologies, the different after diversity maximum demand planning requirements that have been translated into operational limits within the networks across Australia that captured quite a bit of robust discussion and challenge in leading to what the generation control parameters are, what the export limit of 5 kVA or higher actually means, and what it means for those who may actually, in terms of NSPs, push the barriers of that and go higher to be allowed to be able to do so, while others who are working towards either new planning guidelines or new ways of operating the network to allow the maximum penetration of DER to be able to do that, with this being a starting point and the measurement against compliance being a mechanism of pushing towards ultimately dynamic control. But while we're waiting for the trials to end, there is a sense of ensuring at the moment that there is a limit and there are boundaries that are captured through generation control and export limits so that we can continue to balance and maybe for the moment prioritize elements around network risk that are quite prevalent until all the tests and trials through Open and other trials that are happening in South Australia, for example, demonstrate further the viability and the ability for us to apply dynamic management in a very widespread way. When that does happen, there is a commitment on this stream of work from the ENA to be catching up rapidly to allow the connection guidelines to apply in a manner that supports dynamic management. The introduction of non-standard network connections, particularly for the basic guideline, came with a question and with a requirement to understand more. And a lot of what's happening with non-standard network connections is the ability, first up, to work through what it is that within a network that constitutes a basic connection that can be expedited versus known areas of the network that the DNSP or the network operator flags up front within their guidelines due to technical constraints or issues around voltage or otherwise, are clearly due to historic purposes and the construction of the network, less likely to be able to meet the requirements of a basic connection being expedited because they are typically weaker parts of the network that can't accept a basic connection as well as the core part of the network. The idea and the style and the pointing of the guidelines for those NSPs that have to deal with non-standard network portions of their network is to declare those up front so that proponents, so that customers know up front which parts of that particular network is less susceptible to high penetration of DER. And with that early communication and early flagging of the weaker parts of the system, there is an upfront reduction of frustration from proponents and others looking to get a basic connection as soon as practicable, but then meeting the network risk issues. This is the first step in terms of advertising which parts of the network are non-standard and for what reason they are standard. And the iteration on that in future then becomes a means of being able to either make those parts of the network more amenable or work towards what it means to expand the portions of the network that can actually easily absorb high penetration levels of the maximum system capacity. Also came up from the perspective of why and what is the requirement for maximum system capacity of what's installed behind the point of connection when there is a sense of export limitation. And a lot of that currently going back to the point in time and what's happening at the moment with relation to risk, what's happening at the moment with relation to installations that don't preclude a DNSP from still being able to provide a load with the necessary capacity, irrespective of whether the mechanism is up or has failed to operate. And so in the absence of knowledge and transparency and an understanding of what those loads may be that are behind the generation unit, there is a sense of a safeguard of setting a maximum capacity which will ultimately be removed as we work towards dynamic management, so that for the moment, from a planning perspective of a network service provider who's looking to operate the network, there is sufficient knowledge around what the boundary conditions of what that load may be based on what the maximum system capacity is that is installed. Having said that, and it was welcome as part of the feedback that was received in the last few months, there was a comment around some NSPs going past the currently set maximum system capacity and wanting to encourage them to continue to do that. And so as a result, we've introduced the additional sub points within the guideline to allow those NSPs that have gone past that requirement to continue to do so and not to deviate from that to a lower requirement for maximum system capacity without deviation being called out and explained. We forecast, though, that those DNSPs that are already ahead and that are already working towards not needing a maximum system capacity will continue to do so without being prompted by these guidelines. I'll hand over to Stuart now so that he can work us through the compliance and the last element of the feedback that came through between December and February.
Thanks very much, Tim. One of the key aspects that came back from a lot of stakeholders was compliance with the guidelines. And I suppose I'll be upfront, first of all, is guidelines, these aren't mandatory, as they are guidelines, not standards, and they haven't been written into regulations at the moment. However, it should be noted that this project was driven by the DNSPs, who have all made a commitment to adopt the requirements of these guidelines and have all agreed to actually participate in the annual compliance reviews and independent assessments after publication. They're also cognizant that if the guidelines are not effective in driving the desired outcome, that policymakers could make these mandatory into standards and then actually tie those back to regulation. And so after publishing the guidelines, the focus of the period that follows will be both to encourage both further improvements of the guidelines in addition to channeling efforts to supporting how the process of implementation could be improved, but also making sure that we work with the DNSPs in terms of how they actually take these on board and actually get them on board as quickly as possible. As part of that, then within the document itself, it's actually written that the DNSPs themselves must produce their own technical requirements and adopt the structure, definitions, and technical settings as set out within the guidelines. However, there can be some deviations, but as long as they're justified. Where a network decides to depart from the guidelines, they may still be deemed to comply so long as the departure is documented. So they'll need to document why they've made a change to the national guideline, and those reasons for that departure are compelling and documented in terms of the national electricity objectives. So, and they'll actually be assessed as part of our evaluation process on that annual basis. In terms of how quickly they're going to be adopted, ENA is looking at actually, after obviously the publication of these guidelines and the upcoming ones coming forward, we're looking at having a communication piece, but also putting together a transition plan with our networks, so that we can make sure that there's considerations made both in terms of how quickly they can actually take this on board, and secondly, how they can also make sure we can actually look at feedback in terms of the review process and making sure we can actually continually improve these documents going forward. So things like changes to the DNSP's web portals, changes to the technical requirement documents and expected timeframes for their finalisation. We'll be doing our first evaluation of the network's guidelines in 1 year after the publication of these, and so basically we're expecting that all of them will be up to speed within that time frame. And I already know that there's quite a few of the networks that have already got drafts of this and have actually started the work process to actually adapt their current procedures to the guidelines. Also with those, what we're also trying to do is also the guidance on the transitioning connection arrangements, contracts when updates to the guidelines occur. So the whole idea is as we're making changes to these guidelines, it's how that then transitions across into the DNSP's technical requirements. So that then becomes in terms of how quickly that gets taken up and going forward. As we get feedback on these documents, is storing all that in one location. Any other information that comes through, any questions or suggestions received from external stakeholders, again, as they receive, we'll collect those, utilise those to actually then help us in terms of changing our documents, but then how we then transfer that across and actually communicate that out to the networks to make sure that they then are responsive and actually can change theirs as quickly as possible. So going forward, obviously we've just published these documents, and now they're available on the ENA website. I'd encourage anyone who's on the call today to actually go to the website. There's a link at the bottom of this presentation. We've actually got the guidelines actually on that site at the moment. But also some of the other documents, like we've got some frequently asked questions. So basically question and answers for people to actually go through in terms of to actually hopefully answer some of the issues they may have, which weren't addressed through this webinar. It's got these webinar slides, a summary of the submissions and our response to those submissions. And then we've also got all of the submissions that we actually received from external stakeholders on the website as well. So again, I'd encourage people to go to that site to have a look at it. Going forward, we just kicked off development of the MV and HV connection guideline. And we're looking at having that completed and ready for publication by July this year. And in terms of going forward, in terms of the review and implementation evaluations, as said before, the first review of our guidelines will occur in 6 months at a high level to see are there any teething issues or things that have actually not working or things like that, so we can quickly update those or quick changes. And then the first independent evaluation of DNSP compliance to the guidelines will take place 1 year after publication. So that's March next year. And then the following an independent evaluation will be 2 years after that in March 2022. In between those, there'll be ones just done by ENA, so we'll be doing an iterative process in between those. So I suppose what we'll do now is actually go to the questions. Again, there is just the link to our website where the guidelines can be found, and again, encourage people to go and look at those and actually download the guidelines to review it at their own pleasure.
I think you may have touched on this as well, Stuart, but just to reiterate, this slide deck will also be up on the website, on the ENA's website as well.
That's correct.
And so with any questions that we've got right now, we'll start answering them. We'll also encourage everyone that's received, and we'll work through in their own time, the slide deck to reach out, given we appreciate that there's a lot of interest, and we're very keen on making sure that we're engaging and responding to the questions that are coming through.
I'd also encourage, if people have got any individual stuff, they can always contact themselves at Energy Networks Australia to just talk through or to send an email, and we can actually address those outside of this as well. Also, if we don't get to all your questions as part of I realise we've only got 15 minutes to go. If we don't get through to those, we'll try and answer those and put those up on the website as well.
Yep. On that note, yes, we do have, and thank you, Sonika, a number of questions that are collated now that we'll start working through. And the first one that's popped up here is the expectation around their resources being able to bid into the NEMS FCAS markets. I think that's a really future-looking question. I think ultimately the best way to answer that question right now is, in one word, is eventually, yes. And I think there are quite a few parallel processes in place that require, in some cases, separation from the ENA and DNSPs around remuneration of services and how they're identified. We understand that the ANC is running those processes as we speak to work through what it all means and how the resources can be expected to contribute. But on the balance of things, there isn't, as related to this set of guidelines, there is a working towards technically being able to enable in the fullness of time and in working with the open energy networks and other parallel programs for the technical parameters within the systems to be able to contribute to those markets.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. The whole idea is that we're looking at other ways of making that happen. So the whole idea is to, going forward, that's where we want to get to. And as that capability comes on board, that will actually then be built into these guidelines.
Next question there is around what about ESS and what does it mean in terms of how they're assessed? Are they assessed independently of PV at the site? I think initially the way the current guidelines are captured, there is a focus on solar with also an element of expanding ESS that's connected to the solar installation captured within the guidelines as guidance for the DNSP. However, the introduction of an ESS guideline that's separate to the current LV and basic guideline is quite focused on turning the problem around from one that has battery systems, we're going to focus on them solely as part of an installation, into, if we looked at it from the perspective of storage and we were to provide further technical guidance through these guidelines, what can we do to look at the higher adoption rates of ESS independently of the basic and LV guidelines that currently capture a sense of ESS being able to expand behind the meter with solar installation. So the response to that question is less of an assessment independently of PV at the site and more of a concentration at how ESS could be adopted if additional technical settings were to be considered.
The next question is around electric vehicles be considered as DER plugging into the LV network, and that quick answer on that one is yes.
Sorry, Stuart, I missed that.
So the quick answer would be yes on that, around the electric vehicles.
Thanks for being short and sharp, Stuart. Moving along, conscious of time, there's a few more to go. Will maximum capacity be dealt with when AEMO launches the DER register? I think it's a good question to bring up. I think there's a sense of the DER register coming up and AEMO launching the DER register, I think, later this year, with a lot of requirements around initially static data that increases the visibility of what's being installed across the system with respect to DER. Without speaking on behalf of AEMO, our appreciation of what AEMO is attempting to do there is to ensure that there is an upfront set of visible parameters that are initially static, that are observable, and though they are less focused on doing away with a maximum capacity issue being needed, the more networks and the system at large has visibility of what's being installed and controllability of how different elements of the can contribute to the overall system, the more we're going to move towards not requiring maximum capacity limits at all. So I hope that does answer the question. We don't think the DER register specifically responds to maximum capacity issue, but the additional visibility won't hurt, and we'll start moving towards ultimately dynamic management where maximum capacity isn't required. Yeah,
I was going to say, to go with that whole issue around the capacity, we are looking at creating those operating envelopes as part of the Open Energy Networks program. So that's something that's been looked at in conjunction with this as well. So, and that's, again, as Tim was saying before, they'll start off with static operating envelopes, and the whole idea is that slowly move to dynamic going forward as more capability comes into the system.
A very excited DNSP wants to know if they can get their hands on a Word format of the guidelines. I'm sure the ENA can provide that in Word format to its member that's asking the question.
That's correct, yes.
Next one around enforcing a volt bar and other smart inverter settings, DC-AC systems, maybe winners and losers if not everyone plays fairly. Again, we did touch on it during the presentation, but maybe worth touching on it further. A lot of the guideline comments so far contemplate the sense with which there is further penetration that can be achieved through the ability of both volt bar and volt watt to be active and enabled, appreciating that there are issues that need to be worked through. The proposal for how we work through those issues is in very close connection with, as we've done to date, but opening it further to regulators, rule makers, as well as bodies such as the CEC, so that we can start finding how we can balance issues around making sure that everyone's winning without putting the networks at risk. But to dial it back to the intention in the guidelines, it's really focused on pushing the penetration levels up through an ability to be able to ensure the systems are exporting within limits or within envelopes that previously would have been not achievable, and they previously wouldn't have been able to export based on harder limits that aren't then easily attained if it was not for volt bar as well as volt watt being enabled and being made active to allow further visibility and control of the system and the ability of DER to penetrate.
The next question is around specific guidelines for control and protection systems when connecting LV DERs. At this stage, there is no thought of actually creating specific guidelines for those issues. The idea will be that as these update, that any new requirements will actually get built into these documents. However, as part of those review processes, if it was then deemed that that it was so complex that we needed to actually create a new guideline, then that would actually be looked at this stage. But at this stage, there's no one to have a specific guideline around control and protection systems. They will be included and updated within these documents going forward.
That's right. And for that question, it's also, we'd encourage you to look at what's available there in terms of quite a range of protection and control requirements. Yes, they are a starting point, but we have looked at addressing control and protection requirements within the current guideline.
The next question was around the independent compliance review. Will it be made publicly available? Yes, it will be. It'll actually be published on our website.
We've got another question here, just conscious of time, around the 5 kVA export limit analysis undertaken and how it was arrived at. At the end of the day, just to cut a very long story short, a lot of this was actually a sense of working through specific instances, specific networks that can export. I touched on this during the presentation as well with respect to some NSPs being able to push further than others due to the planning standards requiring lower after diversity maximum demand connection requirements that limit the two-way flow to, in some cases, below that 5 kVA limit. And so the selection of that came from the depth of knowledge across the NSP body in not going too far either way, so that we can bring the entire system to a limit that's challenging but prospectively achievable, but not go too far in setting that limit in a way that actually starts putting the majority of networks at risk based on their operational planning standards. Next question there was finding it just a bit reason behind
no technical studies requirements for
the system less than I caught up on that question, so we're organizing all the questions as we're working through them. But technical studies around less than 200 kVA and why they're not required for everyone else more broadly, we've actually set out within the guidelines technical study requirements to ensure the viability of the systems that are being connected, and where the tipping point for technical studies were required was really balancing the extent to which across the networks there was a sense of less risk with certain system sizes that could then mean that we don't need to be slowing down the process through technical requirements, and certain thresholds, in this case around 200 kVA around study requirements, beginning to be the installation capacity sizes that capture the need to reinforce the extent to which the local network is going to be able to handle the installation via technical study requirements.
I'm just cognizant we've just come up to 2 o'clock, which is our closing time. If anyone's got any other questions that they'd like us to go through, please, again, contact us directly either through the ENA webpage or come to us directly. We're very happy to talk and discuss any issues you may have or any thoughts or questions you may do. I'd like to thank you all for participating today. It's been a great day that we've finally got these out, and it's just the beginning of a journey going forward with these documents. So this is we've got them published now. It'll then be obviously the distribution networks now actually creating their own and actually getting those out there, and then also we've got and then the whole evaluation piece going forward. So hopefully people will. Thank you very much for today, and on behalf of myself and Tim, I'd like to say thank you very much.